So, what is the most important and foundational attribute or characteristic of God? I asked that question in my lecture on God's existence. We looked at the first way for God's existence from Thomas Aquinas, one of his famous five ways, which is the argument from motion. And in that context, motion means what? If you said change, then good job. Motion means change. In that argument, Aquinas says that God is a being of pure actuality. And from that argument, we get in my opinion, the most important attribute of God, and the most foundational attribute of God, the one that pretty much steers and keeps the other ones in check, as it were. And that is going to be the attribute of divine simplicity. Unfortunately, this is not a very well-known doctrine or attribute anymore. In fact, I would venture to say that most pastors are not even aware of the doctrine of divine simplicity. So, to be the most important attribute of God, in my opinion, and for many pastors not to even be aware of it, let alone other Christians, what does it mean, and why don't other pastors and people in general in the Christian church know about it? Well, this doctrine, this attribute, was held pretty universally. I can't think of anybody who explicitly rejected it in the early church or the medieval church. It was held at least fairly universally, if not completely universally, by the early and medieval church, even the Reformation church, and many even today in the modern or contemporary church hold to it as well. So, especially since Irenaeus, the doctrine was explicitly stated by him. It goes even beyond Christianity, though, to Aristotle and other Greek thinkers who held to divine simplicity for what they considered to be a divine being. But we see in the church, Irenaeus held to this, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Augustine, Anselm, Apollinarius, Gregory of Nazianzen, Gregory of Nyssa, Ambrose, Thomas Aquinas, John Calvin, Jacob Arminius, Francis Turretin, William G.T. Shedd, Herman Bavinck, thinkers nowadays who were contemporary or almost contemporary because we just lost them, they went to heaven, Norman Geisler, R.C. Sproul. This is not an issue of being Reformed or being Catholic or Protestant. Historically, of course, the Catholic Church, other than the Eastern Church, was the only church that held sway in the Western world anyway. And the Catholic Church was universally in agreement on divine simplicity. But it wasn't an issue of Catholicism versus Protestantism, as you just heard. There are many Protestants who held to that. That was the traditional teaching in the Protestant world, as well as in many circles today. Many people, whether you're Protestant or a Catholic, Calvinist, Arminian, whatever, many people hold to the doctrine of divine simplicity. So what in the world is that doctrine, the most foundational, important doctrine that I'm talking about? It is the doctrine that God does not have parts, that he is not put together of different kind of parts. So we saw, for example, in the argument from motion for God's existence, material things are put together of act and potency. Okay, those are seen as metaphysical or philosophical parts to a thing's being. Now, we can look around us and see all kinds of parts to physical things if you wanted to point things out. And there's different parts to our bodies, different parts to the cameras here in front of me, or the computer in front of me, the different pages in the books are different parts. And there are other kinds of parts we talk about in philosophy, such as body and soul. Those are normally seen as different parts, and there are different philosophical positions as how they relate to each other and what they are. There's substance and accident, for example. So a substance is just the thing we're talking about, the individual. Like, for example, Aristotle uses a horse for his illustration of substance and accident. So the horse can be brown or black, but the horse is the substance, and the accident, which is just a characteristic, would be the horse's color, height, weight, whatever. Form and matter. So we can talk about a thing having the form of a cat, the form of a human, the form of a desk, or whatever. Essence and existence. So we can think about things that have a particular essence that we don't really think exists. If I said picture a unicorn or a leprechaun, okay, we don't, or most of us don't think those things exist, but we know what leprechauns are, we know what unicorns are. So we know the quote unquote essence of these things, even though we don't think that they have real existence. So there is a distinction between essence and existence, both a conceptual distinction and, as Aquinas argues, a real distinction between a thing's essence and a thing's existence. So we can talk about a thing. We don't have to exist. So there's nothing necessary about your existence or my existence or the world's existence. But when we talk about God, if he is this being of pure actuality that we discussed in that previous talk, then as a being of pure act or pure existence, then God is what we refer to as a necessary being, which is really the third way that Aquinas really hones in on that. We can talk about necessity, though, from the first way, but he really makes it more explicit in the third way. Another way that God or that things could have parts is the various properties or attributes of a thing, right? So the color of something versus the weight of something, those are different attributes or properties or characteristics. These are all things that we deny that God has in terms of real distinction if you hold to divine simplicity. But why is it important to hold to divine simplicity? Well, if you, as I mentioned before, if you hold to divine simplicity, then your entire view of God and your philosophical theology is going to go in one direction. And if you deny divine simplicity, your entire philosophical theology and your view of God is going to go in another different direction altogether. I heard Norman Geisler once say that there really are only two views of God. And I don't know whether he was quoting somebody or whether it was his thought. I asked him if this came from him, and he didn't think it was his own thought. He might have been quoting somebody, but it sounds like something he would say, so I'm just going to go with that. I know I heard it from him, but he says there's only two views of God: the Thomistic view or the classical view of God, which is why I call my channel Classical Theology. I follow that view of God, and then the process view of God. Now, among the process thinkers, there's of course different grades of that. There are people in the process theology that teach that God is dependent on the universe. And I'm not saying all Christians hold to that view, but if we deny divine simplicity, then other things fall into place. So if you affirm divine simplicity, then because we already hold to pure actuality, then God cannot change. Because remember, we said that potential is just the ability or that potential power to become something that you're not right now. So I have the potential to stand up. I'm actually sitting, but I have the potential to stand up. Then I would actualize that potential. But if we have that potential, then we're put together these various parts. Well, if we have these various parts, that means that we are composed, and things that are composed need a composer. So it's important to affirm divine simplicity to reject the notion that God needs a composer, because if he has these different kinds of parts, then those parts have to somehow fit together. And then we have to ask ourselves, well, what is making those parts fit together if they're really distinct? This calls into question another foundational attribute of God, which is called divine aseity. Divine aseity, from the Latin words ase, A-S-E, ase. The word aseity means that God is completely independent and does not require on anything else for his existence, his being, or anything of that nature. So if we affirm divine simplicity, we're going to have to maintain God's pure actuality, that God not only does not change, but he cannot change. Okay. Now, we're going to get down the line. I don't want to skip too far ahead, but just to kind of show you where this is going, if God does not have potential and cannot change, then he's always in the same state. Well, if he's always in the same state, then the classical understanding of change has been that time is simply a measurement of change. That the classical view of time is that it's a measurement of change. Well, if God's not changing, then he's not measured by time and therefore not temporal. And if God isn't changing and temporal, then he's also impassible. Impassible means that God is not affected by things, quote unquote, external or outside of himself, or things that are not identical with him. So it's similar to immutability, which says that God doesn't change, but impassibility would deny things like changing emotions or passions or any kind of being affected passively from something, quote unquote, without. Well, if you maintain pure actuality and if you maintain divine simplicity, then you can see how your philosophical theology falls into place here. So if you're a maintainer of divine simplicity, you hold that God has no parts. He's a complete, infinite, unified being. He can't change. He's not in time and is impassible. He's not affected passively by anything externally to him. Not external spatially, but external in terms of existence. So, and if you deny divine simplicity, then you're going to say, well, you're going to have to at least allow for the fact that God can change. You're going to have to allow for the fact that God might be in time and can be affected in a passive way. But you're also going to have a problem for those, at least for those who hold that divine simplicity is important, in saying that, well, if God has these different kind of parts or composition, these different complex aspects to his being, then how what is keeping those together? How do they depend on each other? And then that will call into question divine aseity and whether or not God really is the ultimate cause. Because if he is put together, or if he has these different parts, then what is holding God's parts together? So that would be a problem for those who think that divine simplicity is true and that we want to avoid this kind of divine complexity, as it were. Now, there are questions that arise. So people will say, well, doesn't the Bible say, and isn't it just kind of obvious, that God has different characteristics or attributes? Yes, God certainly has different characteristics or attributes, or as Aquinas would call them, names. God has different names or ways of being described. So God, it is correct to say that God is love, God is power, God is justice. The question is, well, if God is really a unity and has no distinction, then is love, justice, and power really distinct? And the question comes about is, well, if they're not distinct, then it seems like we have this definitional problem where, well, we don't think love and power or love and justice or whatever attribute you want to pick out are the same. So then it seems like we have this definitional identity problem with these various attributes being the same or not. And then if they are different, then the question that becomes, well, how then does that apply to God if God is really a unified, simple being that doesn't have these various parts? If we think that love is a part, or power, goodness, or whatever are different parts. And some have raised, like Alvin Plantinga, who is well known for this kind of objection in his book, Does God Have a Nature? Says that, well, if God is identical to everything he has, which is what simplicity says, that whatever God has, he is. So God is not modified. He doesn't have, like I'm modified in the sense that, I have a certain skin tone. So if I go outside, for a long period of time outside, without sunscreen, my skin changes. I become redder, and maybe if I do it long enough, I might get a little bit darker and get a tan. So my skin is modified. The proponent of divine simplicity is going to say there's nothing that modifies God. All right. So, but if God is all that he has, so to speak, if God has power and is identical with all of his quote unquote attributes, then God doesn't have power in the sense that there's power over here somewhere and God has some of it, or God is not affected by some kind of power over there. God is identical to power. If God has goodness, it's not like God has a certain amount of goodness from the goodness factory. God just is goodness. He is pure goodness. It's identical with his infinite, unlimited being. But Plantinga says if God is what he has, and God has properties, then God is a property. So simplicity says that, well, whatever God has, he is. Plantinga says, well, if God has properties like goodness, power, mercy, whatever, then he's identical to those things, and those are properties. So therefore, God is a property, which seems ridiculous. So simplicity must not be a very good thing to hold to. Well, one problem with this is that the word property, that in the way that Planting is using it, really is synonymous with the word accident, in the way that Aristotle uses that kind of terminology. Well, Aquinas just rejects the notion, as does Aristotle, for his view of God, that God really has this distinction between substance and accidents. So Aquinas and those who hold to divine simplicity just reject the notion that God is modified by these various properties. So instead of calling them properties, like Aquinas calls them names, it would be better to call them attributes or characteristics. They're not things in themselves that modify God. These attributes or characteristics or names are just ways of describing God. We're not saying that God has the property X, where that property somehow exists in some weird fashion, that God somehow possesses it. So goodness is not a thing that God possesses. It's just part. It's not part. Goodness is the divine essence itself. God doesn't have knowledge. God simply is knowledge. He doesn't possess it like he's the subject possessing something. So I would possess knowledge of the weather tomorrow if I look at my weather app. So, but my knowledge is gained and passive and all that. Whereas God's knowledge is, if you remember another talk about the introduction to the attributes in our last discussion on this topic, we said, or I said, that God's being is not univocal, or the way we use words to describe him are not univocal, they're analogical. So when I say God is good, God is wise, God is powerful, God has knowledge, that doesn't mean exactly the same thing when I say that I have it or that you have it. So, in fact, this is an objection that Aquinas responds to back in the 13th century when he lived, that he asked the question, are the attributes or the names synonymous with each other? And the way we look at this is saying, well, the way we understand God is through his effects or through nature or creation. And so when we say God is power, or God has power, God has knowledge, God has forgiveness, loving mercy, whatever you want to say, we are picking out something really distinct in our minds, because power and love and mercy are really different things. But we know in general, and we know God through composed material existing things. But God, as a simple being, we don't have direct knowledge of God. So our knowledge has to describe the simple being of God through our discussion of and knowledge of complex things that we know from experience. So we really mean something different when I say power, love, knowledge, whatever. But in God's own essence, those are all just different ways of describing the one ultimate, infinite unity and being of God. So Aquinas actually addresses that in the 13th century and sees that as a problem. Another typical objection that comes up is what's called the modal collapse argument. And I'll probably go into more detail with these in different videos down the line. But just real quick, since this is a popular objection, the modal collapse basically says that if God is a necessary being, then he has no ability to create anything other than what he did. And oftentimes people use these what's called possible world semantics, and saying that, well, we can imagine a possible world where God created X, Y, and Z. We can imagine a different possible world where God created A, B, and C. So if God is simple, unchanging, and all that, he has no different aspects to his being, and his knowledge is always the same. So he doesn't have the ability to actually create or know anything different than what he actually created. And then, therefore, the objection says that fatalism is the result of this kind of thinking. Aquinas also responded to this objection in the 13th century. And I'll just make it this, I give his answers in brief. He says there's a distinction regarding a kind of necessity here. One is the absolute kind of necessity, and another is called the suppositional kind of necessity. So absolute necessity would be something is necessary if it can't be other than it is. So God would be absolutely necessary. His willing, his own goodness would be absolutely necessary. But there are other things that are not absolutely necessary, but they're contingently or suppositionally necessary. So if I want to travel to another city down the road, I can take a car, I can maybe ride a bus, I can take an airplane if I want to go somewhere real far away, or I can drive there. So there's different ways. So if I want to get from A to B, I have different ways of doing that. It's only suppositionally necessary that I take a car. So I could take something else. Okay. But if I'm actually in the car going, then I'm necessarily in the car. It's like I'm sitting right now. So I don't have to be sitting. It's not absolutely necessary that I sit. But while I'm sitting, it is necessary, supposing that I am. So suppositional necessity is the idea that, well, supposing something is the case, then it just is that way necessarily, not because it had to be, but because that just is the way it is. So God could have made things different in this world. There's nothing absolutely necessary about the world that God had to make it. But seeing that he did will from all eternity to make this world, then it is suppositionally necessary. So it is necessary in a sense, but only because God has always willed it. So is it necessary? This is an interesting theological question. Was it necessary that Jesus die on the cross as a substitutionary atonement for our sins? Yes and no. It's necessary because God willed it that way, but there's nothing in the shedding of blood in and of itself that requires God to do that. God was not under any obligation to send Jesus to die on the cross. He chose to do that. There's nothing that the nature of a sacrifice required, because there was no sacrifice or nature of a sacrifice until God made those things. So it's not absolutely necessary that Jesus die on the cross to provide atonement, but it was suppositionally necessary because that's just how God decided to do it. So when Hebrews says there's no remission of sins apart from the atoning death and blood of Christ, that's true because that's how God happened to will it. That's one way of looking at that objection. Another way, real quickly, is that, well, God is an infinite being and has infinite power. He can make anything. He could make those leprechauns. He could make a unicorn if you wanted to, but he didn't. So there's nothing that requires him because he is an infinite being and it has infinite power. And these effects, these certain kind of creatures don't exist. There are things that don't exist that God could have created. So the necessity isn't in the thing itself that's in any way acting on God's will or intellect, but rather it's the intellect and the will in God that just eternally has decreed to create what he did create. Divine simplicity, I argue, is going to be the most important attribute, because if you accept it, you're having to accept all of classical theology. If you reject it, you're going to reject classical theology, and you're going to have a view that is at least more in the direction of process theology. And that might not be the process theology of Alfred North Whitehead or people who are really saying that, well, God is dependent on the universe, but God is changing, like what the open theists say, that God doesn't know the future. God is in such a relationship that he's kind of giving and taking, and he's really doesn't know what's going to happen, and he's in a sense in a passive relationship, and he's actually changing. Well, to be in a change is to be in a process. So there's a sense in which God is becoming. He's in a state of becoming. And there actually are a lot of very well-known evangelical scholars in the philosophical and theological communities who are teaching that God actually is affected by us, he's changing, and he's in some way dependent on us. So we'll have more to say about that and how simplicity affects these other doctrines as they come up and as we look at a different topic. So I hope this was interesting to you. I hope that you understand the importance of divine simplicity. Please leave me a question if you have a question in the comments, and I'll be happy to answer those to the best of my ability. And if you like this video and want to see more, then hit like and subscribe. And I appreciate you watching, and we'll see you next time.